It is the fall of 1945. At an American military post set among the ruins of a German city, a young soldier is trying to explain to his commanding officer why he has once again missed evening formation. Only a few months earlier, he had been ordered to keep his distance from the Germans. He was not supposed to enter their homes, accept invitations, exchange gifts, or even shake their hands. But now, inside the pocket of his uniform, he carries a photograph of a German woman. They met by chance. Then they began seeing each other. Now he wants to marry her. For him, the war is over. To the army, Germany is still enemy territory. His commander does not see a love story. He sees a breach of discipline, a possible security risk, and a future scandal back home in America. The soldier is told that wanting to marry is not enough. Even if the woman agrees, even if her family approves, even if the two of them already consider themselves engaged, they still cannot legally marry. A little more than a year will pass, and thousands of couples like them will begin receiving permission. German women will board ships in Bremerhaven, cross the Atlantic, and step ashore in the United States as the wives of the same American soldiers who had recently entered Germany carrying weapons. How did that become possible? Why did soldiers from the victorious army choose women from a country that had so recently been America's enemy? And why were German women willing to leave their devastated homeland and follow men they had once been expected to see as occupiers? To understand these marriages, we have to see Germany not as it appeared on military maps, but as ordinary people saw it in the spring and summer of 1945. In the centers of many cities, familiar streets had disappeared. Where homes had once stood, there were mountains of broken brick, twisted steel, and burned walls. Several families crowded into the few rooms that remained habitable. Windows were covered with boards, cardboard, or blankets. Railroad stations were packed with refugees, former prisoners of war, people driven west from the Eastern Territories, and families who had spent weeks trying to reach relatives. Women, children, and the elderly stood in breadlines. Some women were waiting for husbands held in captivity, without knowing whether they were still alive. Others had already received notices of death. Many continued hoping for the return of men officially listed as missing. The war had ended on paper, but for millions of Germans, it had not ended in their homes, their families, or their memories. Into this world came the American occupation forces. At the time of Germany's surrender, roughly 1.5 million American servicemen were stationed on German soil. They were exhausted too. Many had become hardened by the war and uncertain about what came next. They had fought through France and Belgium, and then through the final brutal battles inside Germany itself. They had seen dead friends, destroyed villages, forced labor camps, and liberated concentration camps. No one could reasonably expect them to feel immediate sympathy for the population of the defeated country. Army instructions did not describe Germany as a liberated nation. It was a defeated state that had to be disarmed, controlled, and stripped of Nazi influence. American soldiers were repeatedly warned that a friendly homeowner, a smiling young woman, or a child in the street should not make them forget where the war had begun or what crimes the Nazi regime had committed. At the same time, however, there was another contrast that was impossible to ignore. A German woman might spend an entire day searching for potatoes, coal, or soap. An American soldier received military rations, coffee, cigarettes, canned food, and chocolate. His uniform was not covered in patches. He had access to showers, medical care, the post exchange, movies, and transportation. His unit had trucks, jeeps, generators, and a steady supply system connected to a country that had suffered almost no destruction on its own territory. Even an ordinary American private could look like a man from another world to the residents of a bombed-out German city. A pack of cigarettes could be sold on the black market. A chocolate bar could become a gift for an entire family. A can of coffee could be remembered as a remarkable gesture of generosity. From this contrast came the simplest explanation for why German women became involved with American soldiers. The Americans were well-fed, financially secure, and potentially able to offer a path to the United States. There is some truth in that explanation, but only some. To reduce every relationship to food and passports would mean treating tens of thousands of different human stories as one identical transaction. That would be just as misleading as portraying every American soldier as a completely selfless romantic. Post-war Germany created an enormous imbalance between the victors and the defeated. One person had food, money, authority, transportation, and the ability to leave. The other might depend on employment with the military government or on whether someone brought food home that evening. In such circumstances, sincere affection existed alongside calculation, fear, gratitude, loneliness, and hope. Often, those motives became so closely mixed that even the people involved could not clearly separate them years later. The first meetings did not necessarily happen at dances, and they did not always begin with courtship. The American Occupation Administration needed interpreters, typists, telephone operators, cleaners, laundry workers, sales clerks, nurses, and kitchen staff. German women found jobs in military government offices, hospitals, headquarters buildings, hotels occupied by the army, and local command posts. One woman might help an American communicate with a German official. Another might wash uniforms. Someone else might serve meals in an officer's mess. A woman might work in a store or simply happen to be nearby when an army vehicle broke down in the street. Introductions were made through German families that had been permitted to work with the occupation authorities, as well as through co-workers, translators, and children. Later, there would be organized social evenings, military clubs, and dances. But during the first months, even an ordinary conversation could be treated as a violation of orders. The ban on fraternization was not the invention of a single strict commander. It was part of the broader occupation policy. American authorities were worried about several things at once. First, close personal contact could weaken military discipline. A soldier who began seeing Germans as friends might ignore violations, help someone avoid an investigation, or share military property. Second, commanders feared that former Nazis might use personal relationships to portray themselves as innocent victims of the regime. Third, the Allies wanted the German population to understand that military defeat had consequences. The Americans had not arrived as tourists or as a charitable relief organization. They were supposed to remain an outside force controlling a defeated country. The regulations were deliberately severe. American troops were told not to visit German homes, accept gifts, socialize with local residents, play games with them, or become overly familiar. Early versions of the policy even restricted contact with children. But enforcing the rules proved far more difficult than writing them. American soldiers walked through German streets every day. Their units depended on local employees. They were quartered near the civilian population. Germany contained hundreds of thousands of young American men who had been away from home for months or years, and millions of German women whose normal lives had been destroyed by the war. The wall the army tried to build between them began to crack almost immediately. At first, a soldier might toss a piece of chewing gum to a child. Then he might exchange a few words with an elderly man. Later, he might linger near the kitchen doorway where a young German woman worked. Commanders issued punishments and repeated the orders. But as the occupation continued, it became increasingly obvious that the ban was being violated on a massive scale. Enforcing it selectively only weakened respect for military authority. In June 1945, American commanders permitted more relaxed contact with German children. In July, public conversations with German adults were allowed. By October, the general prohibition on ordinary social contact had effectively been removed. These changes are sometimes described as though an American soldier could then immediately take a German woman to the altar. That was not the case. There was still an enormous difference between being allowed to speak to a German woman and being allowed to marry her. Even when dating was no longer automatically treated as misconduct, American servicemen were still prohibited from marrying German citizens. The Army did not consider marriage a purely private matter. It was a decision with military, political, legal, and immigration consequences. A soldier intended to marry a citizen of a former enemy state, assume responsibility for her, and probably bring her to the United States. The authorities wanted to know who she was. Had she belonged to Nazi organizations? Was she hiding an earlier marriage? Did she pose any kind of security risk? The military also had to determine whether the serviceman himself was legally free to marry. Was there another fiancée waiting for him at home? Or perhaps even a legal wife? As a result, many couples found themselves in a strange position after ordinary contact was permitted. They could walk together, meet each other's families, and make plans for the future, but they still could not legally formalize their relationship. And yet the number of relationships kept growing. Army surveys conducted in the fall of 1945 revealed something that commanders already understood. Young German women were the main focus of American servicemen's social interest. Nearly half of the men questioned admitted that during the previous week they had spent more than 2 hours with German women. The word conversation in such surveys often covered relationships that were considerably closer than simple conversation. For some men, it was a short romance that would end when they were sent home. For others, it was the beginning of a family. The war had ended suddenly, and with it disappeared the purpose that had shaped their lives for years. The day before, a soldier might have been thinking about the next offensive and wondering whether he would survive until morning. Now he faced months of occupation duty, uncertainty about demobilization, and no clear idea of what his life would become. Many of these Americans were extremely young, but they felt much older than their years. They had seen death and had learned not to postpone important decisions. Letters from home might become less frequent. A pre-war girlfriend might have married someone else. Parents were waiting for their son to return, but they could not understand how much he had changed. In Germany, the soldier might meet a woman who had also lost the life she once knew. She understood air raids, the death of relatives, displacement, and hunger. Sometimes shared exhaustion brought people together more powerfully than a shared language. The American might bring a pocket dictionary. The German woman might learn a few English phrases. Everything else could be explained with gestures. At the level of governments, these two people belonged to countries that had been enemies. At the level of everyday life, they could simply be two lonely young people standing among the ruins. Why would a German woman choose an American? For one woman, the most important factor was security. An American uniform meant that the man beside her had a job, food, and a future. To another, America was almost a mythical country. A land of automobiles, large houses, jazz, movies, and stores where no one had to stand in line with a ration card just to buy bread. A third woman wanted to leave a city where every neighborhood reminded her of someone who had died. A fourth feared Germany's future and hoped for a chance to begin again. A fifth already had a child and saw marriage as an opportunity to rebuild a family. A sixth simply met a man she liked and only later began thinking about the possibility that marriage might mean moving across the ocean. Not every woman dreamed of leaving Germany. Many feared America more than they wanted to see it. They did not speak English. They had never left their homeland. They understood that moving away might mean losing their parents forever. A telephone call across the Atlantic was difficult and expensive. Air travel was beyond the reach of ordinary families. A return visit could be postponed for years. However difficult life in Germany was, a woman still had her familiar church, her relatives, the food she had grown up with, and her own language. In the United States, she might be completely dependent on her husband. If he turned out to be different from the man he had claimed to be, there might be no one nearby to help her. Why would an American soldier choose a German woman when he had recently been fighting against her country? Because the word German could quickly stop being an abstract category. A soldier might hate the Nazi regime and still fall in love with a particular woman who had survived bombing raids, lost her home, and never believed in Nazi ideology. But it was not always that simple. Her past could raise difficult questions. Had she belonged to Nazi youth organizations? What had her parents done? Had her family known about the persecution of Jews? Americans who had entered concentration camps could feel disgust toward German society and still continue a relationship with a German woman. Love did not erase history. It forced two people to confront history inside their own relationship and later inside their own family. There were also less honorable motives. Some soldiers treated relationships as a form of entertainment available to men serving in the victorious army. They promised marriage without any intention of keeping that promise. A man might be transferred to another unit and stop writing. Another might return to the United States, where a pre-war girlfriend was still waiting for him. A German woman could be left with a child and almost no realistic way to obtain support from a father living across the Atlantic. There were relationships in which food, protection, and military influence became tools of pressure. In a devastated country, even a relationship that began voluntarily could still be unequal. One side had money, transportation, authority, and the ability to leave. The other risked losing her job, her reputation, and the support her family depended on. But there was another side as well. Some women concealed the fact that a husband was still alive or being held as a prisoner of war. Some maintained relationships with more than one serviceman, hoping to choose the man who could actually help them leave Germany. An American soldier might discover that, to the woman, he had primarily been a ticket out of the country. Cases like these became convenient stories that people used to explain every German-American relationship. This was how the stereotype developed of the calculating German Fräulein, who was supposedly hunting for cigarettes and an American passport, and of the innocent soldier she had somehow trapped. That image was popular with some American commanders and with many families in the United States. It allowed them to ignore one obvious fact. The adult American man had made his own choice too. Within German society, the condemnation could be even harsher. A woman seen with an American might be accused of betrayal, greed, or a lack of dignity. Humiliating nicknames became common. One could be translated as chocolate girl. The expression suggested that a woman's attention could be purchased with candy, cigarettes, or a can of military food. In some places, the insult was used with particular cruelty and a racist meaning against German women who became involved with Black American servicemen. These expressions said less about the women themselves than about a post-war society trying to restore its old order. German soldiers returning from captivity often believed that local women should have waited for them, regardless of how many years they had been gone or what conditions their families had endured. A relationship with a member of the victorious army could be seen as a public symbol of Germany's defeat. The hostility could come from neighbors, relatives, and even other women. People might refuse to shake the woman's hand. Rumors could spread about her. She might be insulted in the street. At the same time, some of those same neighbors were willing to accept the cigarettes or food she brought home to her family. Behind the moral outrage were jealousy, fear, and competition for scarce resources. An American might invite a woman to a military club, give her a ride in a car, or obtain medicine for her mother. Against the background of widespread poverty, such advantages were impossible to hide. Even genuine acts of kindness could look like a transaction to outsiders. The story of Irmgard Steiger and Gerald Jones shows how closely genuine affection could become connected with the realities of post-war survival. Gerald served with the headquarters of the Allied Expeditionary Force and managed an officer's mess. After the war, he was transferred to the Frankfurt area and stationed at Kronberg Castle, which had been occupied by American forces. Irmgard had survived air raids and the financial collapse of her family. She found work as a waitress at the castle. The job gave her access to a place where the American army possessed the food and supplies that were missing everywhere else. In their later recollections, Irmgard and Gerald did not hide the fact that she tried to bring food home. For her family, it was a question of survival. From the American military's point of view, it could be considered a violation of regulations. It was there that Irmgard first met Sergeant Jones. Their relationship developed among officers' dining tables, military orders, background checks on German employees, and the constant feeling that someone was watching them. They began seeing each other. Gerald proposed. The reaction of Irmgard's family became another challenge, as did the need to obtain official permission. But by then, American policy was changing. They married on September 2nd, 1947. Irmgard then moved to Wrightsville, Pennsylvania, where she had to become part of her husband's family and adjust to life in a small American town. For her, the United States was not an abstract country of skyscrapers. America began with specific people who had to decide whether they saw this young woman as a former enemy or as the wife of their son and neighbor. In an archival interview, Gerald and Irmgard described how his relatives and the people of the town received her. Their marriage survived the first difficult years. The interview materials mention the celebration of their 50th wedding anniversary. That does not mean every one of those 50 years was easy, but it shows that a relationship outsiders might have dismissed as a temporary result of the occupation became an American family story lasting half a century. Before couples could reach that point, however, they had to pass through a long bureaucratic process. On December 11, 1946, the American military lifted the general ban on marriages between its servicemen and German women. That did not mean soldiers were suddenly free to marry without restrictions. A serviceman had to submit a formal application through his chain of command, usually well in advance. Then the investigation began. The couple needed identity papers, birth certificates, and proof of marital status. The soldier had to demonstrate that he was not already married. The German woman had to do the same and undergo an investigation into her background. Local German authorities handled the civilian legal requirements, while the army decided whether it would authorize the serviceman to marry. The exact documents and length of the process varied by location and time, but the principle remained the same. A deeply personal decision had to pass through the military system. In an undamaged country, obtaining a birth certificate or proof of divorce would have been inconvenient but routine. In post-war Germany, the archive might have burned along with the city hall. A woman might have been born in an area that was now on the other side of a new national border. Her previous husband might have disappeared on the Eastern Front. Until the state legally declared him dead, she remained married in the eyes of the law. Even if the entire family was certain the man would never return, an official needed documentation. This produced months of waiting, formal requests, and witness statements. Sometimes the American soldier was transferred before the paperwork was completed. The couple then had to continue by mail and hope that distance would not destroy the promise they had made to each other. The investigation into the woman's political past was not a formality. Millions of Germans had belonged in one way or another to organizations created by the Nazi state. Some had joined voluntarily. Others had participated because refusing could make it difficult to study, work, or build any kind of future. The authorities had to distinguish between nominal membership and active involvement. An American soldier might defend his fiancée by arguing that she had been too young or had never supported the regime. Commanders worried that personal feelings might prevent him from seeing the facts clearly. At this stage, questionnaires, witnesses, local officials, and military intelligence officers entered the relationship. Any inconsistency could lead to a refusal. Even permission to marry did not automatically open the door to the United States. Before the war, the American immigration system had limited immigration through national quotas. The foreign wife of an American serviceman might have faced years of waiting. That was why Congress passed legislation on December 28, 1945, that became known as the War Brides Act. The law created an accelerated immigration process for the foreign spouses and minor children of American servicemen and exempted them from the usual quota system. It applied to military brides from many different countries, not only Germany. At first, however, it did not solve the central problem facing German-American couples. American soldiers were still forbidden to marry German citizens. Only after the marriage ban was lifted in December 1946 did the two parts of the process come together. The couple could legally marry and then use the special immigration procedure. Even then, the woman still had to undergo background checks and a medical examination. She had to prove that the marriage was legal, and her husband had to establish his military status. The government had made the journey easier, but it had not turned it into a simple ticket aboard a ship. Documents could move between the military unit, consular offices, and immigration authorities for months. Some women waited so long that their husbands had already been discharged and returned home. Their married life began with separation and a stack of letters crossing the Atlantic. The exact number of German women who married American servicemen depends on what is being counted: marriage applications, officially registered marriages, or women who actually immigrated to the United States. One German historical project estimates that more than 14,000 women married Americans and moved to the United States during the first 5 years after the war. Other estimates suggest that roughly 20,000 German-American marriages had taken place by the end of the 1940s. The figures do not necessarily contradict each other. One may count women who actually emigrated, while another counts marriages that were legally registered, but both show the scale of the phenomenon. These were not a few unusual weddings. They were a significant part of post-war life. By then, the military could no longer treat each couple as an isolated exception. Transportation, screening, waiting areas, and travel arrangements had to be organized. A woman packed whatever she could carry and said goodbye to her parents. Many did not own large suitcases because they no longer possessed very much. Dresses, photographs, official documents, a few letters, a family Bible, or a child's toy. Sometimes an entire former life fit beneath a single baggage tag. Parents might support the marriage while also understanding that they were losing their daughter. No one could promise that she would return the following year. In the post-war world, the Atlantic was not a few hours by airplane. It was a long and expensive distance. The journey often began with a train ride to an assembly point or seaport. The women went through another inspection of their documents and another medical examination. Then they were placed aboard transport ships with other military brides and children. Some traveled with their husbands. Others crossed separately. British, French, Belgian, and German women could all find themselves aboard such ships, although the routes and groups differed. Each woman had her own story, but they shared the same fears. What was waiting on the other side? Would her husband's family truly accept her? Did he actually have the job he had promised? Had he changed during their months apart? Elizabeth Bolster remembered her move as a leap into the unknown. She had been born near Munich, survived bombing raids, lost her home, and fled with her mother to the countryside in search of safety. After the war, Elizabeth worked for the Americans and later took a temporary job as a telephone operator at a hotel in Munich. One day, an American officer tried to place a call through her, but the connection could not be completed. He responded by inviting her to dinner. At first, Elizabeth refused. At the time, she was seeing an American military policeman who owned a motorcycle. The officer continued asking her out, and eventually she agreed. That detail sounds almost like a scene from a post-war romantic comedy. But what followed was far more serious. Elizabeth's future husband worked as an investigator during the Nuremberg trials and spoke several languages. Elizabeth herself studied shorthand and recorded portions of the proceedings. He was Jewish, and before they left Germany, he wanted Elizabeth to see the places where the Nazi regime had committed its crimes. He took her to Dachau and other concentration camps. Their relationship was not built on forgetting the war. On the contrary, marriage forced this German woman to confront what the Nazi regime had meant to her husband's family. She later recalled that she had not previously understood the full scale of the mass murder. Elizabeth's father approved of her decision. He hated the Nazis and wanted his daughter to leave Germany. But her parents did not simply push her across the ocean. They made her a promise. If she was unhappy in America, they would somehow find the money to bring her home. For a young woman leaving her country, that promise was a final form of protection. But no parental guarantee could remove the fear she felt when the ship departed. Elizabeth and her husband sailed from Bremerhaven. The crossing took about 2 weeks. Women slept separately from the men in bunks stacked 4 high. There were infants aboard the ship. Elizabeth carried a suitcase of clothing and an accordion. When she went onto the deck and looked across the Atlantic, she prayed that her decision would not turn out to be a mistake. Many war brides shared that feeling. In photographs, they might be smiling. Behind the smile was a question. What would happen if the husband, his family, and America itself were nothing like they had appeared from Germany? America did not meet Elizabeth with one great revelation. It came to her through a series of everyday surprises. First, there was New York and the apartment of her husband's parents. Then the couple bought a car and drove west until they settled in a small town in Utah. There, they opened a store. Elizabeth struggled not only with the English language, but also with American accents she sometimes could not understand. Her husband even had to interpret conversations with people from different regions of the country. Utah's religious environment was unfamiliar as well. Later, when her husband was recalled to military service during the Korean War, Elizabeth did not want to remain alone and moved back in with his parents. Their marriage lasted about 30 years before ending in divorce. That is an important part of the story. Elizabeth did not become the heroine of a simple fairy tale in which the ship reaches New York and every difficulty disappears. She built a life in the United States and remained with her husband for decades, but family conflict did not vanish. Moving to America could rescue someone from the destruction of post-war Germany, but it could not guarantee a happy marriage. An American passport did not change personalities, erase trauma, or eliminate the ordinary problems between 2 spouses. For some women, disappointment began much sooner. In Germany, an American soldier had appeared wealthy because he had access to military goods. In the United States, his wife might discover that he came from a poor family, had no profession, and was searching for work after leaving the service. Some newly married couples lived in a single room inside his parents' home. The husband's mother might expect her new daughter-in-law to immediately run a household according to American customs. The German woman prepared unfamiliar food, mispronounced words, and failed to understand jokes. Her silence could be mistaken for arrogance. Her directness might be interpreted as rudeness. She might discover that the home her husband had promised was actually an isolated farm, and that the nearest German speaker lived in another state. The American family experienced its own shock. For years, the parents had read about German armies, submarines, bombing campaigns, and concentration camps. Perhaps a neighbor had been killed in Europe. Another might have returned home permanently disabled. Now their son was writing to tell them that he wanted to bring home a German woman. Even if she had been a child when the Nazis came to power, the family might still see her as a representative of the country that had taken people they loved. The parents asked questions their son considered insulting. Had her family been Nazis? Why did she want to leave Germany? Did she truly love him? Or did she simply want to reach the United States? Some families wrote to military commanders and tried to prevent the marriage. Others accepted the decision only after meeting the woman in person. But there were also families that welcomed the bride immediately. They saw her as another young person who had survived the war, and they understood that their son had already made his choice. A mother-in-law might teach her to prepare American meals, help care for a child, and explain to the neighbors that the new member of the family was not personally responsible for the crimes of the Nazi regime. Sometimes the husband's parents became the woman's main source of support, especially if he was recalled to duty or spent long periods away for work. In those cases, the German bride gradually stopped being a stranger and became another daughter in the family. Neighbors reacted in different ways. In a large city, a foreign accent might attract little attention. In a small town, everyone could know that a German woman had arrived. She might be invited to church out of curiosity, questioned about Hitler and the war, or asked to prepare a German meal. But people might also whisper behind her back. Sometimes hostility appeared in a question that sounded innocent. Which side was your family on? The woman had to prove again and again that she deserved a place beside an American veteran. Many tried to become American as quickly as possible. They shortened their names, worked to lose their accents, stopped speaking German to their children, and avoided discussing the past. As tensions between the United States and the Soviet Union grew, West Germany gradually changed from an enemy into an ally, and public attitudes became less hostile. But personal memory changed more slowly than foreign policy. Some women kept German photographs hidden in their homes and showed them only to close relatives. Their children grew up knowing almost none of their mother's language. Only decades later did families begin asking questions. How had their parents met? Why had their grandmother left Germany? Whom had she left behind? Not every marriage survived the cultural divide. Poverty, jealousy, infidelity, alcohol, difficult personalities, religious disagreements, and the veteran's inability to adjust to civilian life could all destroy a relationship. Today, we would describe some of these problems as the effects of combat trauma. In the late 1940s, families were often left to deal with them alone. A husband might wake in the middle of the night, refuse to discuss the war, or take his anger out on the people around him. His wife carried her own trauma: bombing raids, hunger, the death of relatives, displacement, and fear of the future. Two people hoped marriage would mark the beginning of a normal life, but the past took a seat at the table with them. When a marriage ended, the German woman faced a painful choice. Returning to Germany meant crossing the ocean again, perhaps admitting to her family that the marriage had failed and possibly separating the children from their father. Staying meant remaining in a country where her strongest connection had been a man who was now her former husband. Some women returned. Others stayed for their children, found employment, became American citizens, and built independent lives. Even a failed marriage could become the beginning of a family story that remained permanently American. The path was especially difficult for German women who fell in love with African American soldiers. During the war and the early occupation, the United States Army remained segregated. Black servicemen served in separate units and faced discrimination inside their own military. In Germany, they represented the victorious nation, but they did not have the same opportunities or status as their white fellow soldiers. A relationship with a German woman could provoke hostility from both sides. In Germany, the couple could face Nazi racial attitudes that had survived the collapse of the regime, along with broader post-war prejudice. In the United States, some states still prohibited interracial marriage. A commander reviewing a marriage application might ask not only about the relationship and the couple's documents, but also whether the marriage would be legally recognized in the state where the soldier planned to live. Even after the Presidential Order of 1948 began the process of ending segregation in the armed forces, American society did not change overnight. State bans on interracial marriage remained in place until the Supreme Court struck them down in 1967. A couple might therefore receive permission to enter the United States and still discover that their family life was questioned by the law or by the surrounding community. The story of Elfrida and Robert Bennett survives in the archives of the Dwight D. Eisenhower Presidential Library. Elfrida was a German civilian. Robert was a Black American serviceman. Their attempt to marry encountered so many obstacles that they eventually needed assistance from Eisenhower himself. On October 15, 1947, they were finally able to enter into a legal marriage. The archival account of Elfrida's memories describes not only the struggle to marry, but also 50 years of life together, children and grandchildren. Robert died in 1998. Their story reveals one of the sharpest contradictions of post-war America. The army that had helped defeat the Nazi regime was still separating its own soldiers by race. The country that promised a German woman freedom and a new life could prevent her from legally living with the man she had chosen. Elfrida and Robert overcame those barriers. Many other couples did not. Some were separated by a commander's refusal, others by pressure from their families. Some Black soldiers left women and children behind in Germany because they understood that their families would not be accepted at home. For that reason, the number of officially recorded interracial marriages represents only the couples who successfully made it through the system, not everyone who wanted to marry. By the end of the 1940s, the relationship between the United States and West Germany was changing rapidly. The Cold War had begun. The defeated country of yesterday was becoming an important American partner against the Soviet Union. American policy shifted from punishment and control toward reconstruction. The public image of the German bride changed along with it. She was increasingly seen not as a dangerous citizen of an enemy state, but as part of the larger story of foreign war brides. At the level of individual families, however, political reconciliation did not happen through speeches by diplomats. It happened when an American mother first held the child of her son and his German wife. It happened when a neighbor stopped referring to a woman simply as the German and began calling her by her name. It happened when she became a citizen, found a job, joined a church, or opened a small business. Thousands of these women became the mothers and grandmothers of American families. They lived on Midwestern farms, in Pennsylvania industrial towns, in New York suburbs, on the West Coast, and near military bases. Some preserved German recipes and celebrated Christmas according to the customs of their childhood. Others deliberately rejected everything German. Some returned home at the first opportunity. Others did not see their parents again for 10 or 20 years. Some never felt entirely American, even after spending most of their lives in the United States. Others eventually returned to Germany as visitors and discovered that the city they had once called home had become foreign to them. That is why the question, why did thousands of German women marry American soldiers, has no single convenient answer. Yes, post-war poverty played an enormous role. American rations, regular military pay, and the possibility of moving to a country without ruined cities made an American soldier an attractive partner. Yes, some women deliberately searched for a way out of Germany. Yes, some Americans took advantage of their position, and some relationships were brief and deeply unequal. All of that happened. But calculation existed alongside love. Hope for America existed alongside fear of America. Alongside chocolate and cigarettes were months of waiting for documents, arguments with families, the risk of losing one's homeland forever, and the challenge of building a life in a language the woman barely understood. The American soldiers were not always looking only for a temporary romance. After years of war, many desperately wanted to prove that they could once again become husbands, fathers, and ordinary men. A German woman could stop being a symbol of the enemy and become another human being trying, just as he was, to escape the war and return to a normal life. These marriages did not erase the crimes of the Nazi regime. They did not turn the occupation of Germany into a romantic fairy tale. They developed in a world where the victor and the defeated did not possess equal power. That is precisely why they cannot be explained entirely as beautiful love stories or entirely as cynical transactions. In every relationship, the boundary between love, loneliness, security, and hope was drawn differently. Decades pass. In an American home, children or grandchildren open an old box. Inside is a photograph of a young woman standing near the gangway of a ship. She is wearing a coat. Beside her is a small suitcase. On her face is a cautious smile. Behind her is Germany, the country where she survived the war, lost a home or relatives, and met an American soldier. Ahead of her is America, a place she knows only from letters, movies, and her husband's promises. At that moment, she does not yet know whether she will live on a farm or in a large city. She does not know whether her new family will accept her, whether her marriage will survive, or when she will see her parents again. She knows only that she has chosen to cross from one life into another. To her American grandchild, the woman in that photograph is no longer a citizen of a country that was once the enemy. She is his grandmother. She is the woman whose decision made his family possible. And perhaps that explains better than anything else how, after the most destructive war in history, thousands of relationships between victors and the defeated became more than post-war romances. They became part of the American story.